Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is the first in a one-part review series of the Wagon Lord album Jove's Cove, Jove's Cove, Jove's Cove, or however that's supposed to be said. The album is a four-part folk epic which encompasses a vaguely medieval atmosphere enriched by a few clever leitmotifs played on the horns, interesting lyricism, and some of the most reverb-drenched instruments I've heard in recent memory. I should really start off by addressing the elephant in the room, or rather the Jove in the Cove. This is a difficult album to listen to. I don't mean this in the sense that its subject matter is unnerving or anything untoward like that. I mean this in the literal sense that this album is difficult to listen to. I've tried numerous avenues to listen to the Cove of Jove. I tried my old and faithful over-ear headphones, which were a bit of a mid-heavy nightmare, and I gave up 5 minutes in. I tried on my stereo speakers, the bass was far too heavy in places. I briefly tried with in-ear Raycon earphones, and the lows and mids weren't coming through clearly. I eventually found that the best way to listen to the album was on my studio recording monitors using the bass cut switch at the back. It lowers the bass and the mids to a point where the whole balance between instruments becomes around 90% where it needs to be. Sure, there's still that 10% left where the bass is overbearing and the mids are super muddy, but this seems the most optimal way to listen to it, at least for me. When I was looking into the production of the album, I learned that it wasn't really mastered, which explains some of the problems here. Even a gentle compressor and strategic low-cut would have solved a lot of the issues here. There's still some distortion present on certain instruments, but it's so infrequent that you might be mistaken in assuming it was intentional. I don't think this is the case, but after a listen you kinda get used to it. The track listing on the album seems to vary depending on where you listen to it, but for the purposes of the review I'll be listening to the Bandcamp release of 4 songs comprising of just under an hour of material. The individual parts that make up the long songs are available in the information section of each song. Jove's Cove opens up with what amounts to an 11-minute teaser, setting up what is basically what the album is going to give you. Competently played acoustic guitar and interesting brass litter the first part before being joined in by what sounds like the worst MIDI programmed drums I've heard in a while. There's a mercifully short segment in part 2 where the programmed drums and other instruments become what I feel is needlessly distorted, but aside from that, the MIDI drums are just there to carry the songs along. They rarely provide anything of particular note. It really brings down the homemade and folksy atmosphere when a distorted drum pattern comes in and just kinda hangs behind the lovely vocals and brass melodies. The vocals across Jove's perfectly average-sized inlet jump between being used in the foreground and the background, sometimes as a little decoration while the acoustic guitar and brass carries the listener on the journey. It's the lyrics that really stand out here though, if you can hear them. The album's weird at the best of times, but the choice to bury the lyrics behind walls of reverb was certainly an odd one. Part 2 opens with a more pleasant drum pattern and a slow acoustic guitar before giving into a wall of noise, which reminds the listener never to really get too comfortable. There's a lot of tricks up Wagon Lord's sleeve, and the piano melodies drifting in and out while the brass and guitar have a little jam was the moment where I became invested in the album. I became determined to see it through. You should keep in mind that this was around 14 minutes in at this point. If there's one thing that I really admire across the small coast of Jove, it's that Wagon Lord has opted to provide the listener with several meal-sized pieces of music, where other artists may instead offer bite-sized, easily marketable pieces. If you want this album, you've got to be prepared to invest in the near hour-long runtime. While this is admirable, I worry about the long-term viability of these kinds of releases. Wagon Lord has done something really special here. In an age where Spotify and YouTube are steering the average listener to 3-minute bait listens, Wagon Lord has presented what can only be called an epic in a market that is trained to ignore anything over 4 minutes. I hope more people listen to this album, if they can find a way to do so, that is. Not to go on about the production again, but I feel it really warrants mentioning. This album, from a composition and performance standpoint, is near perfect in places. I don't say this lightly. There are elements of part 2 and 3 that I feel cannot be improved on in regards to composition. But this all means nothing if the production isn't there to support the composition. As a listener who had to look at 4 different options for listening before finding a way to comfortably engross myself in this album, it's a shame to think of the number of potential listeners who just don't stick by it. As we dive into the tail end of the album with part 3, Wagon Lord takes a backseat lyrically and instead offers extended instrumental sections which further allows the clever brass lines and acoustic guitar to bounce back and forth off each other, while the vocals hang back, providing a slightly ethereal quality to the whole package. It's these extended instrumentals where Jove's Harbour shines its brightest. while they're littered all over the album, I feel the intro to part 3 is where I made the realization that I wasn't just listening to something good, that I was instead listening to something special. The extended coda of She Doesn't Love You Anymore, while the presumed protagonist sings over the acoustic guitar and brass, is where the album peaks, which also seems to be the lyrical, emotional climax. The MIDI drums, however, make one final flaccid attempt to become relevant at the end of part 2, but for all intents and purposes, from here on, it's a gentle descent to the last part of the album, the titular Jove's Cove. The almost post-ironic voiceover epilogue about going to space wraps up Jove's Firth perfectly. So in case you can't tell from this review, yes, I do think you should listen to this album. I think you should make a concerted effort to find a way to enjoy it according to your own preferences. This is a very special album in a sea of bedroom musicians who are just only putting in enough effort. I just wish it were mixed and mastered. Also, here's all the other names for Jove's Cove I couldn't fit into the review. Jove's Estuary, Jove's Bayou, Jove's Looney Lagoon, Jove's Coves, Keefe's Creek, formerly Jove's, Jove's Harbour, Jove's Nighttime Retreat,